Hi, welcome to Glenohumeral Gurus, a podcast for clinicians with an interest in shoulder pathology. I'm your host, Margie Olds, and it's a pleasure for me to bring you these podcasts. The aim for the podcast is to deliver some clinically relevant content for you, and we aim to take around 15 to 20 minutes. I plan to interview people from all over the globe and talk to clinicians and researchers and anybody with an interest in shoulder pathology so that we can learn how to help these people better. So settle in and enjoy the podcast. Hey, it's my great pleasure to welcome Karen Ginn to the Glenohumeral Gurus podcast. Karen, welcome. I'm really excited to discuss all this work that you've done on shoulder EMG.
Thank you, Maggie. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And so firstly, can you introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us about your physio journey and how you get to be doing what you are doing now and what you're up to.
Okay, well, I'm very old physio. I graduated a long time ago and worked for a while in the public health system. But then I left and joined the university. I joined the anatomy department at the university, where I taught anatomy for many years, but continued part-time clinical work in private practice. And then I eventually rolled in a PhD and chose to do a clinical trial looking at the effectiveness of various treatments for shoulder pain. And what became clear during that was that, first of all, we didn't understand exactly what we were doing. We certainly didn't agree with what we were doing in terms of exercises for the shoulder. And I felt that we didn't understand it particularly well. And so when that was finished and inspired by the work being done at the University of Queensland by Professor Paul Hodges, and with the help of some excellent colleagues at my university who knew something about EMG, we started investigating muscle function at the shoulder by observing what muscles were doing with electrodes. Our aim was to, find out what normal muscles did, so we knew what the norm was, and then to eventually get on to people with dysfunction to see if we could understand their dysfunction. As it's turned out, we have spent the last 20 odd years looking at normal muscle function, basically.
Yeah. And like I said to you before we came online, I was reading you've just made an enormous contribution in this space. There's papers that I hadn't even realized that you had authored that I was like, oh my God, this looks really exciting. So yeah, thanks. I guess just thanks for your contribution. It's been enormous, hasn't it? It's been a life's work in EMG, really, would you say? Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. The things I particularly wanted to talk to you about today is some of the papers that really have grabbed my attention have been around loading supraspinatus in different ways. There's a seminal paper that I think has changed some of my practice about supraspinatus being a external rotator is that you could load it in different ways, shall we say. Can you talk more to that? How could clinicians load supraspinatus in different ways?
Definitely. Before I start, I will be talking about work done by many, many people in our lab.
Yes.
I won't be naming them all, but I just want you to know there are a lot of people involved in developing this body of work, for whom I am very grateful. Supraspinatus. Well, there are multiple EMG studies going back many years that determined that supraspinatus was an external rotator. Yeah. And one of the earliest studies that we did, Craig Botcher was the lead author on this, yes. Confirmed that it is an external rotator, or its primary action is to externally rotate. Now, the action of the muscle is the movement produced when it shortens. And that's what we found that it did. That's what it did. And that's what textbooks should say about it.
Yeah.
What we've also found is that it does not initiate abduction. It's work done by Darren Reed as the lead author. So that thing that is written about supraspinatus in textbook is incorrect. It is active at the beginning of abduction, but it does not initiate abduction. It also works in the same way as the rest of the posterior cuff. And when I say that, I'm talking about supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. They are all external rotators. And not only that, supraspinatus functions with those other posterior cuff muscles to stabilize the shoulder joint by preventing anterior translation of the humeral head, created in normal movement by flexor muscles flexing the humerus.
So can we dig into that? Because this is what I'm really interested to discuss with you. When we talk about supraspinatus, there are different parts of supraspinatus, eh? So do you think that when you look at your EMG, is it only the posterior part of supraspinatus that acts with the posterior cuff? Do you think because if you blend the anterior part through into subscapularis, could you argue we should be looking at supraspinatus differently in different parts of that? Or we can't do that? You think that it acts, the posterior part of supraspinatus acts the same as anterior, and I should think about them the same?
Listen, I think you bring up a good thing about the cuff. The cuff are individual muscle bellies, but blended tendons. And supraspinatus comes into the capsule and it surrounds the capsule front and back to some degree, as do the other cuff muscles, blending upwards as well. So that's true. We have one electrode in supraspinatus. Most of these are indwelling electrodes. We have one electrode in supraspinatus. It's a relatively small muscle. It is not pinnated like subscapularis. Its fibers pretty much run in what we call a parallel fashion, sort of from origin to insertion. So I think we're getting a pretty good idea of what supraspinatus is doing. And we have been recording when we've been doing internal rotation, for example, and we get very little activity in supraspinatus. So I think, yes, different parts of different muscles can do different at different times. But I think the general take-home message from ours and other studies is that its primary action is to be an external rotator, and that it is really should be considered as part of the rotator cuff and part of the rotator cuff that attaches to the dorsal surface of the scapula, or what I would call the posterior rotator.
Yes, and they would all work together regardless of like, if I'm thinking of different types of supraspinatus tears in different location, but the muscle works the same to externally rotate.
It works in that team. It works in that. It's like they're a team. And if you think about it, if you add up the bulk of the posterior cuff, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, it's about equal to the bulk of subscapularis. In other words, you have a part of the cuff that externally rotates, about 50%, and part of the cuff that internally rotates, about 50%.
Okay, and while we might see its activity come on early, that is not to in an abduction plane. That is not to initiate abduction, but to stabilize the humeral head before abduction occurs.
Well,
that's your take.
It does come on before movement is initiated, but so does infraspinatus, so does subscapularis, so does deltoid, and so do all the scapular upward rotators that we were recording from. How can you say supraspinatus initiates abduction when in fact the whole team that is going to be involved in abduction is activated prior to movement of the humerus into abduction?
Yes. Okay, so the other thing I really want, so that's great, because now we can think about supraspinatus as an external rotator and not necessarily to begin abduction, which takes us to a place clinically where I have been using isometric low-level external rotation to what I've been thinking to activate supraspinatus in these irritable cuffs, and then progressively loading them through range into different positions. You have a comment about that? That's what I've been doing clinically. Is that?
Yes, you've got the best chance of turning it on in that action without too many other muscles trying to compensate, I suppose. However, you can never, ever isolate activity to an individual muscle at the shoulder. It is not possible and is not desirable, because the muscles have to work in the team to produce the movement of the humerus, produce the movement of the scapula required, stabilize the humeral head, and stabilize the scapula. All of that has to happen for normal movement to occur. It is not possible to isolate.
Yeah, and neither is it desirable, is what I'm hearing from you, but we could preferentially load it, is what perhaps we should say. And so as I was reading through some of your work before we came online, I have typically been doing that for my patients in standing, but I wonder whether I should do external rotation in prone. Do you have thoughts about whether I should keep my patients in stand? I mean, it's obviously easier for them. They can put their hand on the back of their hand and resist the isometric external rotation instead of lying on the edge of their bed to do that. Because I could preferentially tip the other muscles, couldn't I, is what I understood from that paper.
Well, I don't think prone is important. What I think is probably important for getting more specific rotator cuff rotation is not by the side. So when you're by the side, and we did some work on this as other people have done, and what you do when you turn on external rotators with the arm by the side is, yes, you get the whole back of the cuff, but you also get posterior deltoid. And when you try internal rotation by the side, you turn on the adductors, which are internal rotators, lat dorsi, pec major, etc. Probably teres major. We weren't recording from that. Oh, by the way, and I should say we never record from teres minor, so I'm extrapolating our results to teres minor without evidence from our studies. Not that we don't think it's important, but there's a limit to how many needles and electrodes into people. So what we found, and Craig Botcher's paper on this, we did some isometric rotations in abduction. They were holding their arm in abduction, and we did isometric rotation in mid-rotation range at various load levels, lots of load levels. And what we found was that if you don't let the person, when they're doing it, adduct, abduct, flex, or extend, you make them hold their humerus in the position that you want.
So that unsupported is key.
Unsupported, then what you get is activity in the cuff muscles. That is, like when you externally rotate, the posterior cuff turns on. When you internally rotate, the anterior cuff turns on. But the other muscles, you cannot see a difference in their activity levels between external and internal rotation. In other words, they are not contributing to the rotation torque to any large degree. In other words, it's more specific to assess and treat the rotator cuff, whatever you're doing, loading it, whatever, with the arm not by the side. So you're less likely to recruit those other rotators. Now, to do that, of course, you've got to make sure they're rotating and not doing adduction, abduction, etc. movements when those other muscles.
Is that different with your elbow supported or unsupported, though? What are your thoughts there?
That is a good question, and we do not have specific data on that.
Okay.
So, but I think you've still got, you certainly with them supported, they will not be able to move into adduction or abduction if they're rested on the towels. I guess they push in those directions, but they still could flex or extend, which the rotators that are not rotator cuff muscles do, one or the other.
Yes, so more global muscles.
You could still make them do a clear rotation without other movements, and I suspect it could be like the unsupported condition. But I do know that with the arm by the side, you are recruiting those other muscles. And without direct evidence, I would say that it is better to put people in a supported, in an abducted position. If they have to be supported, certainly for assessment, supported, perhaps in a supine position. And do not let them, as they produce force, do those other movements that would recruit those other
Yes.
muscles.
Yes, because while everything is contributing, as you said earlier, you can preferentially focus on cuff versus those larger muscles, is what you're saying. Is that what I'm?
In a rotation movement where you put the joint in a position or make the joint stay in a position where those other muscles can't turn on. Now, what I think they're doing in our study was what those other muscles were doing was stabilizing the humerus. In other words, what I
Yes.
mean by that is not letting it move into flexion or extension. You turn on pec major to internally rotate, it will also flex. So what you have to do then is turn on latissimus dorsi to prevent that anterior perhaps movement, that flexion movement of the humerus. And so they are working to position that humerus in the position you want and not contributing so much to rotation.
Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it? Human movement is just so complex how that happens. Can I take you back? Because you mentioned there about how the posterior cuff stabilizes against anterior translation. And clinically, that's not necessarily what I see. Clinically, in a person with anterior instability, they are weak with their subscapularis, with a weak belly, and I want to talk to you about that shortly, but weak with belly press, weak with lift off. Their external rotation by their side is not limited, but always it seems overhead external rotation is limited. We know from this body of work that the rotator cuff is position dependent, direction dependent, isn't it? Do you think that we can extrapolate to say posterior cuff is an anterior, prevents that? Because in different positions, perhaps it does something different. What are your thoughts there?
I think the evidence is pretty clear, both from active movements at the shoulder joint and direct evidence where the humeral head, now this is all in normal people, so not in abnormal people, where people translated the humeral head while recording from muscles to see what was recruited. So in our studies, we did flexion through range and we did inner range flexion and extension. So we have
flexion. But prone, eh? They were prone.
No, not always. So the flexion we did in standing and in prone, and we did it in prone. So we had equal range into flexion and extension. And we loaded it appropriately at various load levels. And in all those cases, as we were going into flexion, what we see is significantly, highly significantly more activity, quite a lot more activity in the posterior cuff compared to the anterior cuff, and the reverse going into extension. In other words, when you go into those movements, that's what happens. Now, in a study conducted under the leadership of Associate Professor Rod Green at La Trobe University, they had electrodes in the rotator cuff muscles, and they manually translated the humeral head, and they were recording, ultrasound recording, so they could see how far it was translating, that it was actually happening. And when they translated anteriorly, the posterior cuff turned on. When they translated posteriorly, the anterior cuff turned on.
But they were in a neutral position. What was the position of their arm? Because I think that's my point. If your arm is down by your side, yes, perhaps that is what happens, but maybe that's different in different positions, because we know all that about that. Sorry, that's my cuff blending. We know. And so is it different in different positions?
I can't remember offhand exactly the position the Rafi study was in, but we were in all positions. We went through full range in flexion, and we went to inner range in, at least half range in flexion and extension. So I know that, and they were in, like, for flexion, that inner range was in the overhead position. So I think the evidence is pretty clear. And I also think it makes sense in normal people for muscles to work this way. Muscles are not necessarily good barriers. They are good at producing forces. And so if you want to prevent a humeral head, you want to prevent the humeral head translating anteriorly, and muscles are the things around the shoulder that stop these translations. it's logical that you would turn on, or you would use the muscle, the way muscles work well, which is to produce a force to hold back. But I think the other interesting thing is that it's normal muscle activity that produces potential translations. That everybody has, if you do not turn on your posterior cuff in what I believe is pretty strong evidence, when you flex, you will anteriorly dislocate. And because the flexor will pull that humeral head out of place.
So can I, because I've done only, I mean, compared to the enormous work you've done, I've done a little bit of EMG work. And when I was working with Tim in Kentucky, and what I saw was that if I load you in a closed kinetic chain position in 4-point kneeling, then your posterior cuff is working a lot. Like that's how I could load your infraspinatus. I could load you not as a rotator, obviously, but to prevent. And we also saw posterior shear at the shoulder. And so in that position, infraspinatus is working to block your humeral head sliding backwards. And similarly, when I put you in a side hold and I overexposed you into horizontal extension, then your subscap would come on, which kind of supports my thinking around subscap holding me against anterior and posterior cuff holding me against posterior.
So what I say is, in each of those positions, and I understand you're in 4-point kneeling, I wonder how your flexor was on. Were you recording from the flexors at that time? And when you take your arm, as you did, back into horizontal extension, then your extensor is on. And therefore, that would support the idea that the extensor is pulling it back and anterior cuff is working to prevent that from happening. So what was happening in the other muscles that might have been affecting that humeral head? And I could argue in your examples that the muscle activity that just we were doing in the studies we did was happening in those potentially. And maybe that is the discrepancy that we
which is why I wanted to talk to you, to see what I could learn, to see if I could nut this out further, because I've had a wonderful discussion with Anne Cools a few weeks ago, and she was like, Margie, muscles pull. And then I got off the call and I thought, yes, they do concentrically, but eccentrically they also could allow some control eccentrically. Muscles work both ways, we know that. EMG wise, what can you tell me about the difference between concentric, eccentric, and perhaps even isometric?
So when we were doing dynamic movements with the EMG, we always had a movement tracer on there, various different sorts. We tend to use a thing called a draw wire sensor, but whatever we were using, we were aware of the movement trace, and you can see that in our studies. And so we knew when they were working concentrically and eccentrically. And what you see is that exactly the same muscle pattern occurs concentrically and eccentrically. All the muscles that are active concentrically are active eccentrically at lower levels, but working exactly the same pattern. And in fact, it's true isometrically as well. You work isometrically, you recruit exactly the same muscles that you recruit when you work concentrically and eccentrically.
Yeah, so the same pattern exists. If you didn't have the tracer, so if you look, so clinicians should keep in mind then they need to think about whether that muscle is eccentric or concentric, unless that is reported in the study, eh? Is that?
Yes. So what is described as the movement, and if we're reporting, a movement EMG study, there should be some sort of movement trace, so you can correlate the EMG activity with where you are in space at that particular time.
Yes. Okay. The other questions that has come, I mean, this is a wonderful opportunity for me, so thank you for your time. I spend quite a lot of time reloading or addressing subscapularis because I see these weakness in this places, whether it's weakness or loss of control is probably another conversation. I know you've done some EMG work in subscapularis and compared belly press with lift off with internal rotation. Can you talk to us about that study, what your key findings are there and what you think is important for clinicians?
Well, I know there's belly press and lift off tests that are done for subscapularis. And obviously, we're testing that muscle in its inner range where it's shorter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We compared those with tests with the arm by the side and internal rotation supported up in 90 degrees. And we found no difference in the activity levels. You can turn on subscapularis equally well, mid-range, with the arm by the side or up in 90 degrees supported as you can with belly press and lift off. I guess the difference is you are just testing a different part of range, but you can do, you don't have to do it with a belly press or a lift off. I'm not saying they're not good tests. I'm just saying what we need to do is make sure that when someone is pushing hard, they're doing what we want. And so, with belly press and lift off, the lift off test, for example, is got them in an internal rotation position, but they're doing an extension, and it's turning on subscapularis a lot, maybe more evidence for how it works to stabilize the joint.
Maybe.
Maybe. But belly press, I find it, and when we were trying to get normal people to do it, they were doing it badly. Like, there was lots of protraction occurring as they tried to push hard. So I think the evidence is that you can test the strength of subscapularis in lots of positions. We didn't find that the stated tests, lift off and belly press, were better than a straight internal rotation resisted position. And in those internal rotation positions with the by the side or out at 90 degrees, you can test it mid-range, you can test it inner range, you can test it in outer range.
But you did find when you looked at that study, you could preferentially load their other global muscles as well. Do I understand that study, that if you looked at those in front, then you were much more likely to get pec major activity, and if you looked behind, you were much more likely to get latissimus dorsi and teres major. So if I wanted to preferentially decrease the contribution of them to my subscapularis, I could facilitate it that way?
Well, you can, but if you want to preferentially take both of them out, do it up at 90 degrees, do it not by the arm by the side, as we showed in the study by Craig Botcher, where we were turning on the cuff preferentially. Now, they was unsupported up there, and I've made an assumption that if we make sure they're just rotating, it might be true also of a supported position.
Because at some point he was lying, do I have that right in my head? He was lying supine, resisting internal rotation.
That's what we did when we compared belly press and lift off. We were doing it supine supported, and we also did it with the arm by the side. So, and in all those positions, the activity levels in subscapularis was equal. You can equally well turn them on. I think you're just testing in different ranges. And if I might add, horse muscles have such large ranges at the shoulder. They move through such large ranges. My clinical experience would say that you can test a muscle in mid-range, it's not too bad. You can test it in outer range, and it's not too bad. But then you test it in inner range, and it's either painful or very weak, very different. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that maybe a single test in mid-range is not enough to tell us what might be happening with that muscle.
And maybe as you say that, maybe that's what I'm seeing in my instability population, because I put them with their hand behind their back into inner range, internal rotation, and they're weak. And then I put them into external rotation, inner range, and again, they're weak. And so maybe they're just weak in inner range, internally and externally, and I shouldn't be trying to differentiate them. I mean, what I do then is load them in that position, and then I get good results in terms of their pain and their function. But I thought I was preferentially loading them. Don't you love it when you have a little light bulb moment? I thought I was loading preferentially the posterior or anterior cuff and thinking how clever I am, but actually I'm just loading them in a range, aren't I?
I think if you're doing a rotation movement, you will be preferentially loading one or the other, of course. But
Yes.
yes, both of those that you've just described to me here are testing them in inner range. And,
Yeah.
that's in some shoulder presentations. Obviously, in other shoulder presentations, they test weak in outer range. And I think that can be reflected in their active movement tests or what they tell you
Yeah.
that they can't do or what is painful when they, excuse me, when they come into the clinic. Because
Yeah.
I think all of those things are giving you clues as to how you should be testing to make sure to I don't know, to confirm or not your generating hypotheses as you're
Yes.
examining somebody.
Yes, yes, yes. And so the other thing I wanted to discuss with you is most of these EMG studies are done in a healthy population, aren't they? And I'm trying to extrapolate all your work to that population of instability patients that I see, or that, and so what do we need to be careful of here in terms of generalizing? Can you maybe explain to clinicians why most of the EMG studies are done in healthy people and where you think the gaps might be in the assumptions that we might make?
So I think that obviously we wanted to get into looking at abnormal people to see if we could
Yes.
really work out what was going wrong with their muscles. And my lack of understanding of EMG when I first started made me believe that for quite a while. Now, firstly, we had a lot to learn in normal people. And so that took us a long time, first of all. But secondly, it is difficult. So if you want to find out what's happening in abnormal people, you've got to compare to normal people. Now,
Mhm.
if you're looking at muscle activity levels, the only way to compare is to normalize the data to something which you can then compare muscles, compare tests, compare people.
Mm.
What's normally the most valid way to do that is to look at a maximum voluntary contraction for each muscle that you're looking at, or at least get something that turns them on to their maximum. And then you compare activity in that muscle to its maximum, and each muscle is compared that way. And then you've got a valid comparison.
It's a percentage, isn't it? That's typically how you see in
Yes.
it,
And that
percentage.
allows you to compare between studies as long as they're doing the same normalization procedure, etc. Now, the
Yes.
problem with now, you don't need to do that if you're looking at what's initiating movement. You don't need to normalize. But anything that says that you want to look at activity levels, you have to normalize. And the
Mm.
problem is that people with shoulder pain can't produce, well, you're not sure you're getting maximum out of it. You think it's dysfunctional. And
Yes.
and getting maximum out of it is difficult. And
Yes.
many studies that have tried to do this have not found differences between abnormal people and normal people. And I think one of the reasons is they're not comparing oranges to oranges, that
Yes.
the normalization procedure for the abnormal people, I would suspect, is not valid. It's difficult. We all know that pain inhibits people,
Yeah.
pushing hard and contracting their muscles. And if we think there's something wrong with the muscle, then why wouldn't we assume it was happening during a maximum contraction?
Yes, of course.
So
What's
it's
the way forward here then, Karen? What are we ever going to be able to understand that, or you think it's just not possible? That's one of the limitations of EMG is we're not going to be able to use it in people who have pain because we can't normalize.
Well, as I said, we can look at initiation of movement. You don't need to
Yes.
normalize there. It's a timing thing.
Yes.
You can look at raw data. But we recently published a paper where clever people that I work with, physicists, considered looking at phase defect, sort of phase analysis. Now, I cannot
Okay.
presume to tell you the details of this, but it looks at where it looks at waveform analysis to look at where
Mhm.
muscles are being recruited. What you need to do is multiple relatively fast movements and look at the patterning that occurs. And we looked at, gosh, I think it was 12 people. I can't quite remember how many people had pain, and compared them, and they had various sorts of pain. We didn't come in with a diagnosis. They had some had instability signs, some didn't. They just had shoulder pain, and
Mhm.
we compared them to normal people. And what we found was significant differences in their recruitment pattern. In other words, the phase where muscles were coming in. With normal people, it was very specific. And once again, can I say that when we were going in deflection, back of the cuff was and extension front of the cuff was coming on. But they could have been decelerating, of course. So, but that was happening. But for the abnormal people, and it didn't matter how long they'd had it, whether they were unstable or just painful, they were all over the place. Now, it's only a preliminary study. It was not trying to look at these individual groups of, there weren't enough people with dysfunction to say that. We were trying to validate a method. And I think the evidence is there that we could do it this way. And I would hope that someone looks at that and takes it further.
Interesting, because that looks like perhaps the future of where we might be heading to.
I think it is. I think it could be. And then perhaps we could start working on our awful diagnostic labeling system for shoulder conditions, which are not helping us much at all, in my opinion. And we could start looking at muscle dysfunction as categories for driving treatment.
I can see how that might work. So, Karen, I need to wrap up because we could obviously talk for hours around this. I recently saw that you had an online course advertised for physios. Can you tell us more about how they could access all that information and what that looks like?
Yeah, so this is an online course that's come from I was asked to run a master's course at, specialty master's program at university in Sweden, and I did, and then taught it a few times as a continuing education program around Europe. And the idea was to take the evidence that we had on normal muscle function to try and educate therapists about how muscles are really working, the implications of what we've found, and how that might inform their clinical reasoning process to find the right exercise for a particular person on a particular day. And that's what the online course is really that. So we go through a lot of the evidence, and then there's a section called application where we go through an examination process and various exercises, explain the muscle dysfunction, and then look at a case study to try and put it all together.
And it sounds wonderful. Yeah.
That's available on the APA, the Australian Physiotherapy Association, continuing professional development website.
Okay. I do. So maybe you could send me the link and we can put that below for people to directly access. That will make that easy for people. So just to wrap up, I think, there's such an enormous body of work, isn't there? If for clinicians, what do you think are the key take homes? If you could summarize your life works in a few sentences, what do you think is important for clinicians to understand?
I think they need to understand the functional anatomy of the shoulder. That's really the evidence that we have. Our diagnostic procedure classification isn't helping. Our imaging procedures help, but to a limited degree. Our special tests we have are not particularly useful. What we have is an understanding of what normal should be. So I think if we can understand that, then we can interpret muscle function from what people can't do. And so we can then develop more specific targeted exercise programs to improve that muscle function. And if I could just give you an example for rotator cuff muscles are not just rotators. They have to be able to rotate. They have to be able to rotate and work with each other to rotate in opposite directions, to turn on harder when they need to be, turn off when they don't need to be there. But they also have to provide a medial force. They've got to work together to do that. So they coordinate with each other to pull in, to hold the joint together. And they have to coordinate to produce the rotations that are part of normal movement. So rotator cuff coordination could be a big issue in a rotator cuff dysfunction. And on top of that, they've then got to coordinate with the muscles that move the humerus, because I would say in different directions, you have to use different parts of that cuff harder. Just rotation exercises to strengthen them is not going to be enough. You have to build exercises that train all that all those recruitment patterns, those complicated recruitment patterns that allowed the joint to function properly. And I haven't even mentioned the axioscapular muscles in that.
Maybe we could get together another time to talk about some of that other work, because yeah, that would be wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Karen. That's been absolutely fabulous. It's been great to have you on.
It's lovely talking to you, Margie.
Thanks for joining us for today's podcast. I hope you've really enjoyed this content. You found some clinically useful tidbits, and some of the content has been thought-provoking. If you have other ideas for content for these podcasts, then please reach out to me on social media via Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. I'm happy to get your feedback about the content, and if we can improve that in any way, or talk to researchers or clinicians who you would like, then I'm happy to do so. Don't forget, you can follow me on my social media for some more up-to-date content. You can also access me for patient-specific help. If you'd like to do that, then I also offer that service via telehealth worldwide. If you're looking for a shoulder brace, you can check that out via our shoulder braces on flawlessmotion.com. And if you wanted an online shoulder course, then I have a range of shoulder courses, through from an introductory shoulder course through to return to sport and a shoulder instability course. The instability course was designed to accompany the clinical concepts paper that we published in the Journal of Athletic Training. You can access these courses on margieolds.com or flawlessmotion.com. That's flawlessmotion.com. And every course comes with a complimentary question and answer session, so we can drill into your understanding of the key concepts of the course. You can also join our Facebook group, Glenohumeral Gurus, and follow along for the conversations and discussions on this page. And otherwise, I look forward to you joining us for the next podcast. Thanks for your time. Until then, stay well, take care.